Hey everyone, you are listening to the Divergent Conversations podcast. We are two neurodivergent mental health professionals in a neurotypical world. I'm Patrick Casale.
And I'm Dr. Neff.
And during these episodes, we do talk about sensitive subjects, mental health, and there are some conversations that can certainly feel a bit overwhelming. So we do just want to use that disclosure and disclaimer before jumping in. And thanks for listening. So Megan and I are going to talk about our own experiences of ADHD, our own kind of zoom out perspectives of what it was like as children, adults, teenagers for ourselves. And then we're going to get into DSM criteria and kind of go through the three different types of ADHD. So where are we starting in terms of?
Let's go through like the criteria. And yeah, again, we're doing this partly because it gives structure to the conversation, but also just transparency. If someone is pursuing a diagnosis, like these are the criteria, at least in the States, this is what's used. In Europe, it might be slightly different, but a lot of these would still be included in what's used in Europe. Okay, first of all, when we're talking about ADHD, there's three subtypes. You already mentioned that. So it used to be, right? Like people can be sometimes confused because like, well, I was diagnosed with ADD. So it used to be that, and then they put all of it under ADHD, but with different subtypes. So like inattentive subtype, combined subtype, or hyperactive subtype. And I have a Venn diagram that shows this. Maybe we could link it because it's probably helpful to see it visually. So if you have, 6 criteria of inattention and 6 criteria of hyperactive, then you've got the combined type. Or for an adult, actually, it's just 5. So those are the 3 subtypes. And then also the subtypes ebb and flow throughout the lifespan. Like it's interesting. You'll look at prevalence rates. And so like hyperactive subtype tends to be more common around like young childhood age. And then inattentive type is more commonly diagnosed in adulthood. So I think like we don't want to think about these as static boxes, but it's a bit more dynamic in that at one time you might go to a clinician and they might diagnose you with ADHD inattentive type. Possible you would go at another point in life and it would be combined type. So there's some ebb and flow to these. Okay, but yeah, I think we should, when we're looking at the DSM, the first bucket is inattention, and there are 9 different symptoms that are highlighted and to meet criteria. 6 if you're a child, or 5 if you're 17 or older. So let's just go through these. This is going to be fun, or like really sobering. So the first one, often fails to give close attention to details or make careless mistakes in schoolwork, at work, or during other activities. So misses details, work is inaccurate. Do you meet this criteria, Patrick?
I think it depends. Like, I would not say all the time, but I think that there's also a flip side for me where I am having to work so hard not to miss the details or to overlook something or to drop a ball that I'm juggling. Mm-hmm. So I would say for me, not as much.
Mm-hmm.
What about for you?
Kind of a mixed bag in that I definitely miss details, and my spouse would agree. But I also have OCD, so there is a lot of checking behavior that like is kind of a safety net for this. And there's a lot of compulsive checking. But no, I like, oh my gosh, I have so many expensive stories for this year. So this is a great example. And it was one of those moments of like, okay, maybe I can stop doubting my ADHD. Not that I don't doubt it that much, but experiences like this are very reinforcing. So I took a trip with one of my children to California recently. And I've been doing that a lot because I have learned I really need sunshine in the winter. And I was being so careful, like, right, we were booking airplane, we were booking Airbnb, and we were booking a car rental. So I was doing my obsessive checking and I like made sure, okay, like all the dates are aligned. Yes, we're flying on the date of the Airbnb. And then the night before I go to check in for my flight and I don't see my child's ticket. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I only bought one airplane ticket. I like just did not buy my child an airplane ticket and I was being so careful. So then I had thankfully there was another ticket left, but it was a very expensive ticket. Um, so that would be an example of missing details. Yeah, so I do actually have a lot of examples like that. Paperwork, like like DSM paperwork, not DSM. What's the driver's place? The DMV. DMV, like any kind of paperwork is so laborious for me, partly because I'm like struggling to understand, but also I typically miss details. Like even when I'm doing contracts with people for like public speaking, I feel like I end up going back and forth because they're like, actually, can you also fill out this section of the paperwork? So yeah, I do. This causes me quite a bit of stress.
I appreciate that perspective. And I think that makes me realize how much like accommodation I've had to build into my life so I don't miss details too. Cause I do the obsessive checking, also OCD. But I also have like folders for things that are labeled specifically. I have certain like calendar reminders for me to do specific things because if I don't do all of the things, and it feels like sometimes you have to get the system just right. I know you've mentioned like the Goldilocks thing on here a million times, but that's how it feels. And if I don't do one of those things, then it's much more likely that something's going to fall through the cracks and I'm going to miss the details. And then all of a sudden it's going to snowball.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing I do want to say while we're talking about OCD, so a person, especially around this missing details, an ADHDer might develop compulsive checking because they are prone to mistakes, which that in and of itself wouldn't be OCD, that would be compulsive checking. And then a person, we know a lot of us also have OCD. So like for me, it's both. I do compulsive checking, which I think is compensation for the ADHD, and then I also legit have OCD. Um, so I just want to clarify that as listeners are hearing this, that you might have developed some like compulsive checking around this, not necessarily OCD, and it could be both.
Sounds like another episode.
Yeah, we should definitely do an episode on OCD.
Yeah.
I have a lot of avoidance around that. OCD is that's the hardest aspect of neurodivergence that I live with, and for my children as well. So
Yeah.
I have a lot of avoidance of talking about. Actually, that's not true. I kind of like talking about OCD, but I also like, yeah, I have feelings about OCD. Okay. um, Anything else about that, about attention to details, or should we move on?
I think that makes sense to me. And I think that people listening are going to either like say, oh, that is really something I struggle with, or it's going to be more of that gray area of like, well, sometimes, or I have a mechanism in place to
Hmm.
support myself. And I think these are the things, those mechanisms, those accommodations, those adaptations are the things that a lot of people in society do not get to see because we've gotten
Right.
so good at creating them because we've had to out of necessity.
Yeah, I mean, this reminds me of our autism series, how much we talk about you have to ask the deeper questions to get to the person's internal experience. So like you could ask this in a clinical interview, but then it's like, okay, well, what do you do to avoid, to avoid
Right.
mistakes? You want to be listening for those compensation strategies that take a lot of energy and time.
And that's why I'm
Yeah.
so glad you mentioned what you mentioned about your child's ticket, etc. Because when you first asked me that question, I'm like, no, not an issue. Then I start thinking about it more and more. I'm like, oh yeah, there's so much like in place to create like a safety net. So
Hmm.
I
Hmm.
think that's a struggle for me a lot of the time is like it is very much face value at the question, and I'm not thinking much deeper until I hear the details, and then I'm like, oh, now I'm processing that. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Or like here's another example, and it's still like, still haunts me. So in grad school, and this is when I was at Princeton, there was one course that was like the hardest course in the seminary. Everyone knew this. And I studied so hard for it. Partly it was a subject of interest. And I was like, I'm gonna do so well on this test. It's a test that like they gave very few A's. And I got every question I answered right, but I got a 92. And it's because there was a back. and there was a part where you're supposed to answer 6 questions, and it was on the back, and I answered 3. And, like, that's such a classic example of I spent hours and hours and hours studying, and then when when it came to taking the test, I just either misread that you're supposed to answer all of them, or I missed the back of it, and I like, it haunted me because I was like, I could have gotten 100 because I knew all of those answers, and I probably would have been the first person to, like, ever get 100 on that test, but I didn't because I missed the back.
That would haunt me too.
Okay, so the second, it's interesting. For me, like the language of the DSM is symptom, I guess trait. These are worded so much like symptoms. I'm having like second symptom or second experience. How about experience? So
Let's
the
go.
second experience that is identified. So this would be, yeah, is often has difficulty sustaining attention in tasks or play activities. Difficulty remaining focused during lectures, conversation, or lengthy reading. Um, this is one of the reasons I had a hard time seeing myself as ADHD is because I often am doing activities in my interest. And so I was like, well, no, I can focus for long times. Or like I used to be an avid reader. I don't retain what I read very well, but but actually even that I would like reread paragraphs or pages over and over because it'd be like, oh my gosh, I started daydreaming. I have to go back 5 pages. But yeah, this was a reason I had a hard time seeing it because um, I'm often doing things in my interest. And that's where the interest-based nervous system comes into play. I wish that the language on this would kind of qualify when it's outside of your interest, because that's when we tend to have difficulty sustaining attention.
Yeah, I love that usage of that specific language. And I absolutely think we need to do an episode on that because that's such an important distinction. If I'm not interested in it, there's no chance in hell I'm paying attention. And
Yeah.
so many times, right? Like, how often do you or any of our listeners experience like, well, you're not paying attention, you're being rude, you're being disrespectful? Like, if I'm in a lecture, if I'm in a training, if I'm in a talk, I'm probably on my phone or on my computer and I'm doing other things because that's helping me pay attention. If I have to sit and actually absorb and it's not within that
Mhm.
special interest or that that zone for me, it feels almost impossible. And
Mhm.
I just get so distracted so easily with that.
I just had a flashback to grad school for my side D of like I would spend so much time. I'd always like try to kind of sit in the back so other people couldn't see my computer. Cause yeah, that was the first time I was in school where we had like internet access and like you're multitasking often. And I would do that. And it would often help me focus. Sometimes not. I'll own
Sure.
that. But it like the experience of boredom for me just like it hurts all over my body. Like I just want out. So yeah, I was always multitasking. And some multitasking helped me focus, whereas some was just I was trying to escape boredom. Um but even before that, like I'd always be doodling. Yeah, I mean, school is just so boring.
It really is. It really is. And if anyone's gifted and just able to learn differently or absorb differently and retain differently. Like I told you this before, I didn't go to class and I could get A's all the time. I just absorbed things very quickly. And
Yeah, I'm
sitting,
jealous. My brain's not like that.
sitting in a lecture or sitting in like an hour or 2 hour class, I was just like, I ever tell you that I had to take Intro to Canada when I was in my undergrad, which is the most boring lecture
Be
experience.
careful. We've got Canadian listeners.
It was so, maybe it was just the professor, maybe it was the material, I don't know. But I would just get up and leave that class every single day until I eventually had to drop it because I was like, I can't keep missing these
Mhm.
classes. Found some strange elective that was a much better fit. And but those are real examples of like it feels like you said it's so uncomfortable in my body when I'm bored or when I
Mhm.
can't pay attention or when I can't focus. And then I will start moving, then I will start like fidgeting, then I will start like shifting over and over and over again, and I have to get out of it. I can't just sit there.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think the worst combo for me is when I'm in a conversation that is boring, that I'm trapped in,
Mm,
because it's both like the sensory demand of being in a conversation plus the boredom. That to
yep,
me, like my body just all like I'm having a visceral response just talking about it. Like the combination of that is just, ugh.
yep, absolutely,
Um,
100%.
One thing, this is where I think my autism kind of helped out my ADHD, is I've always been pretty good at associative thinking. And so, for the most part, if I was, especially got a lot easier in college and grad school than K 12, but I could typically, for most courses, find a way that it linked to something of interest. And if I could make that association in my head, then I could be engaged in the class. And I think I did all kinds of tricks like that, I think. Like, okay, this is kind of like this thing, which was an area of special interest. And that was one workaround I did to get myself interested.
Yeah. I think you mentioned that in one of our episodes. Yeah, one of your special interests, I can't remember what it was, you kind of
Oh,
incorporated
yeah,
into
sex trafficking. And then I
yeah,
would study that, and yeah, yeah. But even in lectures, I would, if it's like, okay, they're talking about this, but I can make a few jumps and connect it to this idea I am interested in. Okay, now this is interesting.
right, absolutely. But if you can't do that, then it's kind of like vacancy.
Then it's then it's multitasking on the computer. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Um so yeah, that's hard. And this one is socially hard cuz like there's times I wish that people can tell when we shut off, and like I think that is hard when it's um like when you're socializing, but the thing the person's talking about is just so boring.
Here's here's a real meta experience. When you are in those conversations and you shut off and you know you're shutting off, but then you start to realize that the other person realizes that you're shutting off. Then you have this really meta experience, like looking at the conversation from a different lens, like outside of your body. Like, how do I get out of this? But I also understand that this person knows that I'm not interested in this. And it's such a strange dynamic. And I don't know how to navigate those things. I just know that my face and my body betray me most of the time. And then I ultimately like end up backing, sometimes like moonwalking backwards out of conversation, sometimes just to get the hell out of there.
And this, okay, so this is interesting. I could see this. So one thing we talked about with autism is the tendency to bring conversations back to our special interests. I could see this also being true in ADHD. Like I feel like I definitely do this of, if I'm wanting to continue the conversation, but I'm bored out of my mind, then I will either try to like emotionally increase the emotional charge, either through like increasing in like vulnerability and emotional intensity of the conversation, or bring it back to a topic of interest. Like I will try to do something to get me back engaged. And so I could also see how this could look like, oh, well, you're always bringing it back to your passions or your interests. But it would be a way of like, well, I'm trying to get my body engaged and my mind engaged in this conversation so I can be here for it.
Yeah. And we've talked about the autistic perspective of some of these social experiences and the struggle areas. Um, ADHD, same way, right? Like the other person in this dynamic can oftentimes say, like, you're really rude or you're being really kind of self absorbed or self centered because you only want to talk about the things that you're interested in. And I just imagine that it can be hard to be friends with us sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, I think in a like healthy dynamic, there's space for both people's subjectivity. And if
Yeah.
every time the person we're talking to brings something that they're of interest in, they feel shut down or they are shut down, like that's not a healthy dynamic. Um, so like I right, like this is where I could see one argument being like, well, this is how our brain works, so this is how we are. But it's like, well, I think yes, like this is how our brain works. And I think we can stretch. Like I work hard to learn to like like my spouse is really into European soccer, and that is very uninteresting to me. But I try to remember to like ask questions about it and to be engaged because I know that that's a point of connection and I value him. So I think it is important to also like stretch ourselves to be like, to be there for the people we care about.
Yeah, absolutely. 100%. I agree. Absolutely.
Um, okay. So the next one up is often does not seem to listen when spoken to directly. Mine seems elsewhere, even in the absence of an obvious distraction. So that kind of like daydreamy or just not there. Have you gotten that feedback from folks?
Absolutely. Um, uh, yeah, it happens a lot, especially I think if so distraction, um, it could be executive functioning related sometimes. Like my mind is
Mhm.
just kind of slowly shutting down. So it becomes so much harder to sustain attention and focus and conversation. It could be the conversation's not interesting. I mean, there's a lot of reasons for that, but I've gotten that many, many times.
Yeah. Yeah.
What
I
about you?
think, I think my hyper arousal and masking was so high that when I was in conversations, I didn't necessarily get it a lot. I get it a lot. My kids are really good at calling me out. They'll be like, "Oh, you're not actually here." Or sometimes they'll ask a question, I'll give an answer, and they'll be like, "Is that a real answer or is that like your fake answer?" Which is like autopilot answer. So my kids will have do a great job calling me out on this and I'll catch myself. The one thing that I got a lot in college and also like in adulthood is people would be like, "Oh, I saw you like walking to class and I said hi and you just walked right past." Or like people will call my name and I didn't hear it. So there's a lot like I've gotten a lot of feedback around that of people trying to get my attention or call my name and me not hearing it. Um, but when I'm one on one with someone, I think it'd be interesting now, but back in the day, I think my masking and hypervigilance was so high that this was not a super common feedback that I got.
Yeah.
Okay, often doesn't follow through on instructions and fails to finish schoolworks, chores, or duties in the workplace. Starts tasks but quickly loses focus and is easily sidetracked.
Yep. I can give personal examples of this because it happens all the time. But I just know that this is one of the experiences for me, in addition to the ADHD tax that we were talking about, especially that financial piece or whatever, that brings up a lot of like shamefulness because
Hmm.
it's that like stereotypical lack of follow through of like you can really get into this internal narration of I just can't follow through on things. Like and this as an entrepreneur happens all the time. I have all these ideas. I start them, I get like 6 steps in, and then they no longer interest me. And that's my reframe now is like, well, it no longer interests me. It's not that I can't follow through on things because I certainly can, but that is a constant where if it's not interesting to me, it's so challenging to follow through on completion of any task. So that's why we see like all the videos of people posting like, here's my laundry in big piles in my laundry room, or here are the dishes building up in the sink, or, all of the things that a lot of ADHDers tend to experience because that stuff feels laborious. That stuff feels meticulous. It feels boring. So where is the incentivization to getting it done?
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. I have so many half finished projects and I think I have 5 half finished ebooks or digital workbooks right now. Like, oh my goodness. Yeah, I call it tree branch projects. And actually I think I've created kind of a work ecosystem where this works, but all like last week I went to go post I was gonna go schedule my like social media posts, but it led to like an 2-hour long tree branch project of like, oh, actually I should add this resource to my newsletter resource vault. And then I need to make a landing page for it. And then I need to make like a sequence for it. And so I have things in place where I can do these tree branch projects and like And the more I've been able to create a lifestyle where I can just follow these tree branch projects, it's been helpful, but it also is stressful to know there's like a lot of half finished projects out there. For me, I never really struggled with getting assignments in on time. And again, this is why ADHD was hard for me to see. For me with school, as soon as I would get a project on my plate, I would do it. And it's like this anxiety. Actually, I think this might be like partly demand avoidant stuff, but like I would feel so anxious knowing something's on my plate. So like as soon as I would get a syllabus, I would try to do all the homework assignments. And it's this myth of like once I get all the tasks done, then I will be free.
Right.
So I like would do the opposite where I would start projects early, which would sometimes backfire because I didn't have all the information I needed. So that is one of the reasons that ADHD felt really hard to see, but it's this like need to get demands off my plate because I just feel like the pressure of them as long as they exist. So for school, unless I just missed it because like I missed a detail, tended not to struggle with getting assignments in.
I didn't struggle to get the assignments in, but I definitely always waited until the last minute. And like there was no, it didn't matter how easy it was. It didn't matter how long it was going to take me. I needed that pressure um, in order to propel into that. And I think we look at that so often as like a negative, but I mean, it was been working for me my entire life. So I just started embracing that as well. Um, but I think that for me, when you're talking about the pressure of getting those things done, a lot of that pressure for me comes with like responding to things. And that could be like emails that I need to respond to or messages. And I will respond to them immediately or schedule send a response because if I don't, I will forget them and then they will disappear forever.
Hmm. Yeah, I feel that of like, oh, this is in my mind now. Or even like I have energy to respond to this now, or interest. Like I'm interested in what this person is saying. So I've got to respond to it while the interest is hot.
But I have
Um,
tricked myself, like you said, of like once I get all these responses done, man, I'm going to feel a lot of relief. That
uh-huh.
really that never comes. So
More, yeah, like more demands come. That like we're chasing the end of the rainbow with like once all these demands are done. But yeah, yeah. Yeah, no, one of my children once said, like, "I just can't wait till I retire." And they said this as a very young child, and it felt so much sadness for them. And I also totally got it of this idea that there's like, especially I think if you're PDA and have like intense demand avoidance, like it just feels so daunting, like facing demand after demand after demand.
I
Um,
cannot resonate with anything your child or you've ever said any more than that because that has been my fantasy since I was a kid, where I've been like, I can't wait to not have to do these things, like because I
mhm.
just can't tolerate the day to day demands and the piling up and the stress and the energy that goes into it.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, I'm going to sidetrack us or derail us, so we can continue on.
Okay. Um, so often has difficulty organizing tasks and activities. So difficulty managing sequential tasks. This is really like executive functioning stuff, right? Like or messiness, keeping things in order, time management, meeting deadlines, disorganized work. So organizing tasks, which organization, right? There's a lot that goes into that. There's the, okay, I've been given a project. I've got to break it down into
Yep.
different tasks. That tends to be harder for our brains. And then there's time management of like, okay, I'll get this part done and then this part. I think that's also kind of why I just jump right in because my brain's like, I can't break this all down. So I just need to like jump in and do it. I have a really hard time shifting. So like I just gave this big talk and for the last 3 weeks I feel like that's all I've been focused on cuz I can't and I've got other projects that like I could have been like okay, I'll work on this for a few hours and then this, but like I just have to be in a messy ecosystem of like working on it all at once versus like breaking it down. I'm not sure if that's making sense, but
I mean, to me, it makes perfect sense. Like when I see, um, all the steps, all the different like processes for something, it's so overwhelming that I start to shut down kind of. And this,
Mhm.
I can think specifically like cooking is a nightmare for me. So if I,
Yeah, I don't cook. Yeah,
yeah,
absolutely.
I try. I mean, if it's not like put meat on grill and grill meat, okay, that I can do. That feels like straightforward. But if I'm making if I'm like following a recipe, I get
So
so
stressful.
frustrated. It's so
Me too.
stressful.
And then all the cleanup and it's
I
like,
can't cook
oh,
at the same time. For those of you
yeah.
who do both, that you're a magician. But like Ariel, my wife will come home and be like, um, I see that you cook dinner and I appreciate that. But look at the kitchen. Like there's like you use every pan that we own. And I'm like, yeah, and it's so hard for me to be like, so how do we cook this thing and this thing at the same time and have them done at the same time?
Mhm.
That feels like that's wizardry to me. Um, so I can't do that. It's always been a struggle. And again, like if I'm looking at a project for work that I really even want to create, so I get lost in that because
Mhm.
it becomes too overwhelming. So for right now, I'm like, I've got to create all these sales pages for these retreats for 2025. And I'm just looking at like blank documents right now, knowing like I have to do this thing, then this thing, then this thing, then this thing. And I'm like, can I just get to the place where it's finished? Like,
Mhm.
a really hard place to be mentally to like just struggle with how to put things in order sequentially.
Totally, totally. I just had an aha moment of I've been saying probably for 2 years I want to build courses. So like I have all these workbooks and any one of them could be turned into a course. And I think the education component of me, I'm like, yeah, I get that. I could like that could be module 1, that could be module 2. But even though I know like that would be such a smart business decision and I actually have interest in it, I get the combination of decision fatigue of like well, what platform and what kind of course but also there's the steps. There's so many steps in building a course that like I keep trying and I keep running into blocks.
For sure. I was, doing these like live coaching courses for so long. And my VA would be like, you should really make these evergreen and you should chop them up and make modules and then do this in like sequential order. And I'm like, if I'm not going to show up live, I'm just not doing it because I get so overwhelmed. Would it be the smarter business decision? Absolutely. Do I feel like I can sit down and actually figure out the steps in order to like piece everything together? No. And if I start doing that, I'm going to get distracted, going to start working on something else, and that thing is just never going to happen.
Mm.
And that is honestly really, really frustrating for me. And it's probably one of my most frustrating experiences within my ADHD experience is like that inability to sequentially do something or kind of like zoom out and be like, okay, now we're going to do this. Now we're going to do this. This is how this goes together. It's like, no, it's either going to happen organically or it's not going to happen at all.
Yeah. Yeah. I am relating so much to what you're saying. Yeah. And this is why, and maybe this might be too much of a diverge than we want to go, but like this is why for me, so about 6 months ago, I noticed a lot of people were shifting from executive functioning um, disorder or disability to difference. I actually like it feels really invalidating to call it a difference. Like for me, it is very much a disability. And for a lot of the like ADHD folks I work with, it's like this is a disability. So I don't know how you feel about the language, but to me, I think it's absolutely an executive functioning disability. And
I
I think
agree.
we really see it in this criteria. And so it is, but yeah, we should do an episode on that. There's a lot of like, a lot of people are shifting language away from disability, which I'm like, um, in both autism and ADHD spaces. And I'm curious about that. And I am worried about that. Yeah, but that's another conversation.
So we're going to pin like 4 total conversations from today. I'm trying to keep a mental list of like, what did we say?
We're
So we're
doing the
going to,
ADHD tree branch thing. Like, okay,
yeah,
so we want to talk about interest-based nervous system,
check,
disability,
check.
language in the neurodivergent space. Um, okay,
OCD.
I lost the other ones. If there were more.
Yep. We want to talk about OCD.
Oh,
Uh,
OCD. See, I told you I have so much avoidance around OCD. I
I
blocked
just
it.
said it like 4 times. You're like, I don't remember what we said. Um, yeah, no, okay. Pinning it all for,
Okay.
yeah. Okay.
You'll be our holder of the chaos. Okay. So we are getting close to getting through the inattentive criteria. I'm going to try and let's see if we can get through it in one episode. Okay. So yeah, difficulty organizing tasks. That's huge. I think this is where executive functioning coaching can be helpful, where systems can be helpful. My like, yeah, I feel so much stress around this. Like my business, my goal for this next year is to like actually create processes and systems because my business is chaos. Because I really struggle with organization. So this is just
For sure.
yes, this is a hard one. Okay. Often avoids, dislikes, or is reluctant to engage in tasks that require sustained mental effort. Schoolwork, homework, preparing reports, completing forms, reviewing lengthy papers.
Check.
Mhm. For me, again, it's if it's outside of interest. And then the other thing that like made it hard to see this again, it goes back to that demand. If it's like, I know I have an assessment report to write, I'm gonna typically sometimes I would procrastinate, but typically it's like I need to get it done
Right.
because then I have freedom. Um, but things like for me, I feel this in like life, like activities of daily living, like scheduling medical appointments, going to the dentist, going to like basically things impacting my health and like daily living. This is where I really feel difficulty engaging in a lot of those tasks. Um, if it's a demand that's been placed on me, I will often, sometimes I'll procrastinate, but I'll often do it to get it done.
Right. Yeah, I can relate. And of course, we all have, well, I shouldn't say we all. Um, so many of us have so many medical appointments and like medical needs to take care of. And it can be so frustrating to try to have to like prioritize those things when you really simply just do not want to. And you don't have the space or energy to. So they live in
Mhm.
that life quite a bit.
Yep. Yep. Um, yes. Yes. That one. Yeah. Oh, and then the other thing for this one is it doesn't specify if it's outside of interest. So that would be a nuance I would add. Because we can often sustain our mental energy if it's within our
Right.
interest. Often losing things. I'm already laughing. Often losing things necessary for tasks or activities. So for kids, like school materials, pencils. For adults, like phones, telephones, earbuds. Um, I lose stuff all the time. And it's yeah, it'll be like my phone. I'll like set it down. Like I look for this thing like probably 10 times a day because it's like I put it down somewhere. I have no idea where, but
I don't experience that one as much. Um, I I try to think about like stuff like that. Like more often than not, I'm throwing stuff out that I actually am going to need in the future, or deleting something that I'm going to need in the future, and that's a real problem for me. But it's not the same thing. Um, one thing that I lose constantly is the TV remote when it's in my bed. I'll put it down next to my arm, and I'm like, I have no idea where I put it. Take the sheets off, take the blanket off. I'm like, oh, it's literally right there. But ultimately, not something that I struggle with very often.
that's so interesting. Yeah, this one's a big like losing keys and losing like I spent a lot of time stress searching for things. Um yeah. Yeah. And I think that is probably that like because a lot that those of us who struggle with it will like put things down and just like it not register like where
Right.
um the whole launching pad idea is great and when I remember to use it, it's great. That idea of like you have a place where you put everything you need to launch in the morning, so like wallet, keys. I keep trying to do that, but I'm just not consistent with keeping things where they're supposed to go.
So when Jennifer and I were in Italy looking at that village that we're having that summit at, the woman who was the host, who I identified as like ADHD, immediately lost her cell phone 5 different times in the 2 hours that she toured us around. We had to go back into her car, go back to different like houses that we were in or different like settings for her to go and be like, I know that I left it in this room, in this setting, in this location because I do it all the time. And it was just like constantly circling back, constantly circling back, constantly circling back. Am I surprised now when emails to her about our event aren't getting responded to? No, not not a single ounce of surprise. So
I mean, that's a good point of like this experience or trait of ADHD, like this can be really stressful. Like if you think about those acutely stressful moments, especially during travel of like I just lost my phone or my passport, like this is a huge cortisol burst of stress in some of these moments.
yep,
So this absolutely I think is one of those things that just is so hard on the ADHD nervous system is
sure.
yeah. I'm glad for you that this is one that you don't experience um as much. Okay. We did that. Is often easily distracted by extraneous stimuli. So for older adults and adolescents, this could also include thoughts. I'm really glad they included that. So yeah, that could be just people around you talking, sounds. It could also be your own thoughts.
Yeah, that's a constant experience for
Mhm.
me, and it's also I noticed that like those sounds will get louder at times that become even more challenging to experience. The thoughts will become more overwhelming and intense. So like it's just a constant experience where there's like this distraction all around me and constantly having to like rein myself back in, trying to like ground myself, trying to stim enough to focus. Like it's really hard.
Mhm. Mhm. I think this one thing I've talked about is um so I know I've used this metaphor before, like how as a kid I used to go under the pool and just sit there. And then when I'd pop up, it's like I'd be so overwhelmed by all this stimuli. This
Yeah.
is, I think, why I do so much with like hyper focus or deep focus, because when I'm not in deep focus, it feels like I've emerged from the pool and my thoughts are all over the place. Um, and so I'm often then like trying to find my next way back underwater. And by underwater, I mean like intense
Yeah.
focus because
Totally.
um it's so distracting and overwhelming to be in that boppy place. Um which is why like days like today, like I have this and then I have a community meeting and then I have emails. Like I have a lot of bopping and like I'm noticed like I feel more stress on days like this where I'm bopping versus like I have no I mean, I guess like I kind of feel some hyper focus in this conversation, but I don't have any like blocks of hyper focus time.
Right.
So I feel more like kind of arousal in my body because it's like I'm in the boppy place.
Makes sense. And I that's a great metaphor too. That's great imagery to think about. Like, because when you're underwater, it's kind of that peaceful place, right? Like
Mhm.
everything's just you can really hone in or focus in, or just like your mind's not going from one thing to the next, or you're not juggling 2 million different sensations all around you. Yeah. Hyper focus is definitely where I get most of my work done. And I think that's why I spend so much of my time like floating around away from it, because I'm like, if I'm not in that place, it feels like a moot point. Like I'm not going to really accomplish much or get a lot done.
Mhm.
That's why I
Mhm.
take advantage of it too. Like
Yeah.
trying to get back into that place so that you can have large outputs or bursts of creation or energy too.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. No, I like um it's interesting. I kind of attribute this to my ADHD. Like I worry a lot about wasting time, and I think days like where I'm bopping between things, I feel really inefficient for one, but I feel
Right.
like I'm working all day, and I it just feels like a wasted day, which I realize is not like the best way to think about existence or time. Um, but yeah, I do. I have a lot of stress about days and blocks of time spent in that kind of
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Hmm.
That's
Um, yeah. The other, like, thing I'm thinking about oh, no. Okay. Think about a few things. Okay. Reining in the thoughts. Um, I would be curious other people's experience of, like, being in a restaurant or a coffee shop. Like, I always used to feel guilty about this because I was like, "I know you're not supposed to eavesdrop," but like I can't, it's really hard not to listen to other people's conversations. Like it just, my brain just is tracking these conversations. Um, so I don't know if like that, I feel like that would be part of this. Like it's hard to just filter out other conversations. But I remember always feeling a lot of guilt about that because I was like, I feel like I'm just someone who like eavesdrops all the time. But I think my brain, unless I'm like putting on music, my brain can't really filter out conversations happening around me. It like, and it's weird. Like, do other brains actually do that? I'm asking the wrong brain, but
Yeah, I was gonna say I bet if we asked like Jennifer, she'd be like, "Yeah, I selectively choose which conversations I participate in," and I'd be like, "What the hell are you talking about?" Um, but the interesting thing though for me is a lot of the times, even though I'm hearing those conversations in a coffee shop, etc., that's where I get a lot of my work done, and it actually allows me to focus more while I'm in those environments, opposed to
Mm,
potential quiet and stillness of my home.
that's so interesting. Huh. Yeah, I guess it's kind of like body doubling.
Yeah.
Um, mhm. Yeah, if I put on music, I can, but I can if I'm not putting on music. Um, that's interesting. Okay. We've got one more here. So, is often forgetful of daily activities. So, doing chores, running errands, returning calls, paying bills, keeping appointments. Oh, maybe I should have said all the medical stuff here. Yeah, this is I don't do activities of daily living well at all.
I think this is one that I do well, but another example of one that takes an enormous amount of mental energy to do it well. And I think again, it's like that fear of letting it fall through the cracks, wanting to check it off the list, not wanting to have to be over or like burdened by it. But yeah, I do those things pretty well.
So, this is kind of an embarrassing story. Kind of can't believe I'm sharing this. But in college, I don't know. And it's interesting. Maybe partly, I mean, I should have known, but I think it was just like it's so hard for me to get myself to do this. In college, probably like halfway through the year, this is so gross. My roommate washed my sheets for me because I hadn't washed them like all year. I don't know that I would have washed them like the whole year if she hadn't washed them. And even now, still, like my spouse will will get like will do the sheets, and if it was left to me, they would be done very, very infrequently. Um, like I am kind of gross, and I realize like okay, I should probably unpack that narrative I have, but like when it comes to things that require effort around things like hygiene, around like washing sheets and doing daily activities, like these things are really, really hard for me.
Yeah. Well, appreciate you sharing that because I can guarantee you you're not the only person who's experiencing difficulty in these activities of daily living. So I think for those who it's really hard for and they have to get up and go to work if you don't work from home or like you have to go out into the world a lot of the time, like can be super frustrating too to just be like, I can't accomplish this. I can't do this thing, or it's taking me all of my mental energy to do A, B, and C today. And that doesn't sound like an enjoyable way to go through every day either.
Mm-mm, mm-mm. And it's interesting to me, like you struggle less with that one. And I struggle less with like follow through on schoolwork. And like I almost wonder if there's like a trade-off. Like in my mind, even it's like, okay, I can't do things like clean the bathroom or laundry because I have to focus on like this talk or I have to get this assessment report done. Like those take precedence over activities of daily living and like things for health. And so I almost wonder if for a lot of us, it's like we can have one or the other, but not both.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I do laundry constantly, like 3, 4 times a week. Um, One of
Whoa.
the things I struggle the most with is like hygiene. I want to feel like clean all the time. So some of that could be OCD related. Um, I often take 2 showers a day. Like, and yeah,
Mhm. Showering to me is like my sensory reset. So thankfully I have like, and I can't like start my day without a shower. It just that
Yeah.
feels like part of the routine. So thankfully I shower, but other things are a struggle.
Sure. Yeah. No, I mean, it's an interesting thought process to be like, is it this other priority or is it this priority for me? And how do you weigh those things out about which one takes precedence? That's an interesting dynamic.
Mhm. Yeah, like for me, the urgent demands of I've got something due, like in school or professionally, those like almost always take precedent, which I don't like that, but that is how my brain works.
Yeah.
And then I'm always like, well, when I get done with that, then I'll schedule my medical visits or then I'll. So like the only time I've really gone to the doctor the last few years is like when it's urgent care because something that urgently needs attention has come up.
Right.
Yeah. Not a role model to our listeners. Like
In a lot of ways, yes. And in some ways, maybe not. And
Yeah.
probably vice versa for me too. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay. Well, I think we've been recording for a while. So those are the 9 experiences or traits or symptoms of inattention. So again, if a person experiences 6 of those under 16 or 5 or more of those. And then also when ADHD has been diagnosed and you're an adult, it's interesting. The cutoff is 12. It's very like specific, but these experiences have to have been present before age 12 as well. And again, that's where you really need to look at like compensation, and also you want to look at like stress or demands. Because for some kids in elementary school, like because they're in one contained classroom, they can kind of hold it together. But then the wheels start to fall off, like in middle school when they're changing classes. So you want to contextualize. But for an adult diagnosis, you do need to be able to show evidence that this was also present in childhood.
Yep. Good point.
Okay. So we got to talk about hyperactivity next time.
Okay.
Oh, and impulsivity. Oh, that'll be fun. Question mark.
That's that's a story of my life. So no, these are good. I like doing these series. I know you enjoy the collections. These are super helpful, and I like being able to walk through it this way in terms of like breaking it down step by step or piece by piece.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do too. Okay, we'll have to start thinking up what will our next collection be after ADHD.
Yeah.
Oh, we could do OCD collection.
Do an OCD collection for sure. We can do autistic ADHD collections of there's lots. Trying to pin all this in my brain right now. We got all these ideas.
Go write it down. Go outsource.
All right, everyone. Thanks for listening to the Divergent Conversations podcast. Episodes on Fridays on all major platforms and YouTube. Like, download, subscribe, and share. Goodbye.